Right. So this shadow, we do things a little bit different in the sense that some questions are to answer one, and I've been here getting a couple of calls recently, and today was kind of like the last straw that prompted me to do this series here. So what we'll be doing is going through this. We'll go through this on another one, and we just go to show you and correct the major concept we have here in the Caribbean about coming from Africa. Right, so we're about pick up some of their recordings from what they recorded, right? And pay attention to the dates. Dates are important because they called slavery for operating somewhere around from the 1600s to the 1800s, right? So what we're going to do is show what was actually happening in the Caribbean at that time, right? So we have here new evidence on the origin of the Black Carib, and quote unquote, that's what they call us here in the Caribbean. Well, we never acquiesced being Black or Carib, right? That's just what they call us. With thoughts on the meaning of tradition. This was done by Nancy Gonzalez. Her credentials is here, along with her references. We'll just go through some of the references in the end, but she is Nancy L. Gonzalez, Department of Anthropology, University of Maryland, right? College Park, ND, in the United States of America, right? So you thought some of the literature here in her research, and we touch over into some one other. It's ongoing, as I say, but I don't want it to become too long-winded and lose the interest in this series, right? So we're going to get all the records from when they say slavery was happening, and we're going to prove by their own records that it was not what they were saying it was. All right. So introduction, 27 years ago, I first undertook ethnographic field research among the Black Carib. Again, every time you hear Black Carib, as what they were calling us, so we just going by their research, right? Then a relatively little known group of peasant fishermen / wage laborers on the coast of Central America, right? Over the years, I've revisited them repeatedly. Working primarily in Livingston, Guatemala, but also Honduras, Belize, and New York City. Since that time, also, numerous studies have been made by other anthropologists. We have examined their ethnohistory. That's Bukaj, 1966, Gulick, and there's some of our references, 1976, Palacio, 1973, Social and Economic Organization, Kosminski in 1976, Gonzalez, 1969, Kearns in 1983, Sanford, 1971. So the economic organization, religion, Foster in 1981, Palacio in 1973, Taylor in 1951. The food system, that's Bukaj again, 1970, and Palacio, 1981. Language, home, 1978, Taylor, 1951. Folklore, Hernan Dirks, 1975, and physical status and blood types, as Crawford in 1981, Franshine for Furshine in 1961, Gonzalez in 63, Tejada Gonzalez, right, in 1962. Nevertheless, in spite of all this work, there are still a number of fundamental puzzles. So she's saying, in spite of all this work that they come up with, that they have done, a number of fundamental puzzles remain to be solved in relation to the origins and history of these people and their culture. The Black Carib are a hybrid group living today in Belize, right? You'd see in certain parts, you would hear, when we go to the next article, you hear what type of hybrid they're speaking of and that type of thing. The Black Caribs are a hybrid group living today in Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, as well as urban centers in the United States and England. Phenotypically Negro. Phenotypically means the physical presentation is generally what they would call Negroid. They speak an Amerindian language, what they call Island Carib, which is actually Arawakan, and we're not saying Arawak is more Lokono, right? And exhibit cultural patterns similar in many respects, many but not all, respects to other Creole populations in the West Indies. See Gonzalez, 1959. And I'd like to point out here, the reason why they could see these similarities is because of the different families of the so-called Caribs or the Garifunas. They didn't understand the culture, so the interpretation, this was the best interpretation of how they could have said, right, in terms of what they were seeing, right? They say their ethnogenesis took place largely on the island of St. Vincent in the Lesser Antilles, which you'd find out after you start to check the numbers and they go through the size of St. Vincent, you realize that couldn't possibly be true. The ethnogenesis took place largely on the island of St. Vincent in the Lesser Antilles over several centuries, whereby the early 1700s, now listen, there's the height of the so-called transatlantic slave trade, right? By the early 1700s, two political groups, so they had turned them into two political groups, because they see early on in the next text from 1498, which we could round off to the 1500 to 1690 something, they were at war. And from 1690 something, roughly 1700 to 1800, as you can see right here in the second line, is 1795 to 1797, they had a British war against the Black Caribs. So when were they so-called bringing in slaves from Africa? Hence the reason why when we speak to older people on the island, some of my family especially, they don't know nothing about slavery. They were here on the island and only hear about that talk pick up in the 60s, right? So tell me when, and let me check this out. Let me put something on the board one time. They were stating that the people that were doing these so-called tours or discoveries, right, were quote unquote white people, right? But that couldn't make any sense either based on the timeline, because this time in here, from the 1400s and come up, these so-called white people were coming out of what they call the Dark Ages, right? If you could record back in, go back and research the bubonic plagues and this time, when they came about, and you'd see at certain time, the timings that a lot of exploration was going on, these people were still throwing their feces in the streets, right? Since the reason why they suffered that plague, and a whole heap of them was wiped out. So if they couldn't even build proper sanitation facilities, how were they building ships to explore the New World? So as they call it, right? So we go in again. They say the British remove all the black Caribs who surrendered. That, you gotta watch too, that's pure nonsense, because how they gonna get all the Caribs to remove them? And here in brackets, they say nearly the entire group of survivors. So they come upon a group of survivors who after the war, whoever was warning them at that point, and those survivors they took, right? They couldn't take all the Caribs, because definitely they don't know where all the Caribs were at that time, was wars, right? To the island of Roatan in the Bay Islands of the coast of Honduras, keeping their more Amerindian red counterparts in St. Vincent, right? Historians have placed the number of immigrants variously at about 5,000 or 2,000, and until now, convincing documentary evidence has not been found to establish the actual figure, nor to clear up the details concerning the relocation. Right, so this is just a rough estimate of how much went and is not clear, and that type of thing. That's what they're saying after all the research. Given the fact that all this occurred in the not too distant past, historical documents should have been more helpful than they seem to have been so far in settling some of the basic questions concerning when, how, and under what circumstances they were removed from St. Vincent to Roatan, and just when and why they crossed the Central American coastline, which has been their primary home ever since. That's what they're saying here. So feel free at any point to add any additions or your own research or oral tradition that you hear. Feel free to ask any questions. We know how it normally goes, right? So the answers to these questions are crucial for an understanding of the demography and physical character of the population today, the nature of their culture, and its relationship to other cultures in the Caribbean area generally. So they do admit that what they're finding up in Honduras has relationship to other cultures throughout the Caribbean in general. In addition, they should be of value as a case study for cultural presence and change. Although some historical research have been done, most ethnographers of the Carib have depended only upon oral traditions and secondary written sources, and even those using eyewitness accounts by travelers and missionaries, myself, herself, forget her name, Gomez Gonzalez, herself included, have not been properly critical of these in drawing conclusions and forming hypotheses. So just reproducing what they find and giving their own interpretation of what they found. We would have a better interpretation of what they found because we've been hearing it from our ancestors before we know about these people who try to interpret who we are. Some might attribute our feelings in this regard to the fact that we are not trained as historians, because she's an anthropologist, but I fear there is no excuse for what I now see as having been a crucial deficiency in the historical reconstructions made by anthropologists for the Black Carib. This paper will outline information uncovered during 3 months of archival work in England during the summer of 1982, plus 2 weeks in the General Archives of Central America, Guatemala to be exact, in January 1983. So this paper is based on this 40 years ago, right? Or 41. And 42 in the other instance. I will present some new interpretations to which I believe the evidence lends itself. St. Vincent and the Carib War of 1795 to 1796. The prevailing scholarly view among anthropologists has been that the British drove the Carib out of St. Vincent because 1, they wanted their lands the most fertile on the island, and 2, they feared their slaves would be influenced. They feared their slaves would be influenced to escape and join this free Black population. When they're talking about slaves, this is important to note that they are speaking about other captured indigenous people here. They mention nothing about Africa, right? And three, they feared the depredations of the Carib, who were highly skilled in guerrilla warfare. And this is why I was telling some people recently that Nani was not from Ghana, right? That type of guerrilla warfare that she was putting down was indigenous guerrilla warfare, skilled, highly skilled. That is why she was able to beat them. But that wasn't nothing common. That was not something isolated to her alone, right? That was something common in the defense of the island. Look at all down the way to St. Vincent, right? And we have the Battle of 1699 here on this island, all the way down here on Carib, Miss Noma, Trinidad, in 1699, long before the accounts Nani. And in this account here, written by the one survivor, mentioned everyone was dead. Hundreds of men was dead, right? With no casualties from the indigenous Caribs and them who fought against them. Those were the type of monk style priests that the King of Spain had sent into the encomiendas after they were having problems trying to convert them to Christianity and Spanish way of life, right? We going again. So skilled guerrilla warfare and not reluctant to fight back when they thought their rights had been infringed on, much like us in this tribe today. Another, probably more deep-seated fear alluded to, but not developed in any of the anthropological interpretations, was that the Carib provided a base and springboard on St. Vincent for the French Republicans in the Windwards. So the Windwards were more dealing with the French, and now they are speaking, this year is speaking about the Black Caribs, right? So the French later on in the later centuries, right, like in the 1700s and late 1600s, right, started to befriend the native Caribs and them. The only how that could have happened is if they were looking alike, right? Because the Caribs, as they were saying, very skillful and very fearsome in terms that they're not into the people thing. They're not into no strange people thing. That's why they was even warring people who look like them. All right. So you had to think about this as melanated, woolly-haired people, the French Republicans. That's how we had to think of them. And as we go into the series, and I get the documents on how to describe Cristoforo Colombo, and I forgot his other name, he was described as Swati. So was the king and queen of Spain. There was Swati, black nobility. All right, so they call them in nowadays. A kind of ethnomyopia has prevented us from remembering that there was another St. Vincent in this long, bloody, and expensive struggle, which fully occupied the British forces both in Europe and the West Indies, right? So where it fully occupied the British forces. So where were they going on? How were they going? And who from the British forces was going to pick up slaves in Africa, where still today cars sail in a direct line from the Caribbean to Africa. So they had to go all the route that could only happen 2 times per year. And how they was doing that, if the other St. Vincent in this long, bloody, and expensive struggle, which fully occupied the British forces, both in Europe, right? So they occupied the British forces all in Europe, had to come to the aid, and in the West Indies. In the latter, the French Republican cause of freedom, equality, and fraternity, right? They was coming through with Masonic shit back then as well. took on a special meaning in relation to slavery. And in 1795, the so-called brigands, often led by mulattoes, right? So remember I tell you, after they made friends with the French, them, after they made friends with the indigenous, then they started bringing over mulattoes at first to mix in and also to aid in whatever way possible to the other Swatis royals who were sailing down the side of the Swati noblemen, right? Often by mulattoes, but including blacks and whites as well, as we were saying before, had succeeded in gaining a strong position on St. Lucia, Grenada, and Dominica, as well as St. Vincent. So the French were gaining a lot of traction with the indigenous, right? So this is the French Swatis, right? And Dominica's right. The British had their hands full countering the French in all these places, as well as in trying to gain a foothold on the rich island of Hispaniola, which was simultaneously torn by the same strife of black Caribs fighting against the British. Not no slaves that was brought to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Those are indigenous people to that island and the Caribbeans, because you'd hear later on in this text where they was taking them from the Lesser Antilles and carrying them to the Greater Antilles and so forth. From the point of view of the Carib, the French were a valuable ally in the struggle to retain their homeland. But in the larger scheme of things, the Caribs were merely a pawn in the French plan to take over the entire Antilles. Thus, when it became clear that the Carib French forces in St. Vincent were being continually augmented by replacements landing on the Carib-held Windward Coast, the British sent more troops, activated a local white and free black militia, and finally, even armed slaves in the effort to rid themselves of their antagonists. So these slaves that were slaves from other tribes, that were enslaved from other tribes, or we call them prisoners of war. The British started to use them now against their own brothers and sisters to fight. And this is synonymous with the story of the Buffalo Soldier that they took from the Caribbean and went to fight in America. If you listen to the Bob Marley song, with this type of information, it almost sounds as if he had some sort of knowledge about that, although he wasn't really referring to that. But if they knew the history, then they wouldn't ask him where he was coming from. If they knew they was coming from the Caribbean, then they wouldn't have no questions. Then there wouldn't be a war for the Buffalo Soldiers to fight, or they wouldn't be available for war because they don't recognize them as the brothers or sisters, cousins, and what have you. So, but this still might not have been effective had it not been for the onslaught of an epidemic disease, which appears to have struck down the Carib in a manner terrifying to them. And those diseases were because of the mixing with other peoples that came to them. We get to those accounts, when we get to those accounts, you'd see the and so here you'd see the map, the Yucatan at the top here, right? And this is the Honduras down here, and you know this is connected high up. So there were migrations going this way and that way, just like much like today in the Darien Gap. All right. Right. It was disastrous to their cause. Right? In a terrifying manner to them and disastrous to their cause. Although a detailed description of this pestilence must have await another article, it is important to note here that mortality exceeded 50% among those finally captured, and there is no way to know how many it had killed before the first major surrender in July 1796. This removal to Roatan. We can now clear up finally and with certainty the mystery of how many Caribs landed on Roatan, right? They took them from St. Vincent area and carried them higher up to Honduras. And why it is we have had different estimates of the numbers involved. The widely repeated figure of 5,000 is a rounding off of a number reported as captured or surrendered at St. Vincent and sent to the nearby island of Balizeux or Balizeux, while the British War Office decided how to render them forever harmless. The records show considerable official concern for their physical welfare, but almost no sensitivity to their psychological, social, and cultural needs. While wanting to, so there's just a table here, and they group them up because of the light copper colored, the copper colored, and the dark copper colored. So they group them according to color, because that is what was the easiest way how to group them, because a lot of them couldn't speak our language, 99% of them. So they often made mistakes, hence the reason why they call us Caribs. Keep them far from St. Vincent, right? So while wanting to keep them far away from St. Vincent, it was also hoped that in some way they might be made useful to the British colonial and war efforts. The plan eventually adopted would have been ingenious had it worked. The evacuation from St. Vincent to Balizeux lasted from July 21st to 1796, right? So here's the evidence they're telling you. When I keep telling you they was land swapping these indigenous, this is it right here. Until February 2nd, 1797, during which time, according to their numbers, 4,195 black Caribs, 41 slaves belonging to them, and 102 yellow or red Caribs were landed. The small island was inadequate for such a large number, even under the best circumstances. But in the presence of contagious disease, the overcrowding, lack of fresh water, and poor food supply were devastating. When the transports finally loaded on March 3rd, preliminary to sailing for Roatan, only 2,248 black Caribs were left to make the trip. 300 of these were ill on embarkation, and only 2,026 arrived. See table 1, as the table passed just now. According to contemporary accounts, the disease struck hardest among the women and children, and it also likely that it tended to eliminate disproportionately the elderly as well as the very young. It is therefore probable that the surviving group, which parented succeeding generations and preserved, modified, and molded the culture by which we know them today, included an unusually large percentage of women at childbearing age. In addition, many of these would have just lost suckling infants and thus have been subject to early pregnancy. This, of course, would have increased fertility in the first few years, right? So they just call out some key points that would affect the numbers. Some of them missing, like in terms of those who branch off as well, right? As you see in upcoming accounts. The official British landing roster at Roatan listed 664 men, but lumped together the women and children, who numbered in 1,362 because there were 806 women who embarked, and because mortality on the 5-week journey had been about 10.7% for the entire group. The writer, she estimated there to have been 720 women and 642 children among those landed on April 12, 1797. Many of those children may have been pubescent or prepubescent, but unfortunately, we know neither the age, structure, nor sex ratio among them. The orders to the commander of the small convoy had been to land their charges at Roatan if possible, and if not, then anywhere on the Spanish Main. Provisions consisting of food, seeds, tools, fishing tackle, clothes, and etc. Muskets, ammunition had been provided in large quantities, though not enough to have lasted more than about 6 months. You see table 2 coming up. Supplementary supplies were loaded and approved for dispatch from England in October 1797. But by that time, most Caribs had joined the Spanish on the mainland. So this was saying some of them broke away and thus altered their own fate and perhaps the course of diplomatic history as well. I don't know what that reference is for. Because the Spanish were in possession of Roatan at the time, it has never been clear to modern scholars just what the British strategy was in landing the Carib on that island, right? It was displacement, basically, right? One writer suggested they wished to send a poison pen letter or a Trojan horse to the Spaniards with whom they were intermittently at war during that period, right? So during the 700s, the Spanish and the British were at war. How much white Spanish and white British to have for them to be at war with themselves, be at war with the indigenous and go to Africa and be at war with them tribes to capture people from there and bring them back here? There will never and will never be that amount of white people in the history on the planet Earth, right? Their genetic mutation, thus they can outnumber the original. Never would and never will. Never did and never will, sorry. Because the Spanish were in possession, right. Boom, right. During that period, that may not be far off. When the British fleet, consisting of at least 6 ships, arrived at Roatan, the island was occupied by a few Spanish troops who, when presented with an ultimatum to surrender or be attacked, capitulated without a shot. Given the apparent size of the British fighting force, as judged by the number of ships, it is no wonder. British accounts state that these troops, an indeterminate number, were then sent off to the mainland port of Truxillo to be exchanged for 300 Carib passengers and the crew of one transport which had been captured by the Spanish on the passage between Jamaica and Roatan, right? So all up to Jamaica they were routing because this was the Caribs and them normal route from the South American plate to the North American plate. You'd see that just now. The British seemed quite anxious to return this captured group. So, as I was just to finish my point, they come and met them doing that type of traveling and decide that they'd follow that same type of traveling in order to occupy all the islands and to conquer them simultaneously, right? So the British seemed quite anxious to return this captured group to the main Carib body and went so far as to shell Truxillo in this effort. Having reunited the exiles, the British decided rather suddenly to leave the Bay Islands when they learned that the Spanish fleet of some consequence was approaching, right? They were in poor shape for serious battle, since many of the troops, also attacked by the mysterious malady on Balize, were still sick or convalescent. The Caribs were left with one ship, the captured barracks in which to house themselves, a supply of land and provisions, and British expectations that they would form a permanent colony, right? So they used them to try to flush the Spanish out. And when the other surrendered, then a next set of Spanish come in. So this was what was happening here in the Caribbean. The flight to Honduras. At this point, the historical records becomes more spotty, but there are enough clues to put together a more accurate picture of what happened than we have heretofore accomplished. Although it is not clear who initiated the idea, certainly an alliance between the Spanish and the Carib at this point was desirable and advantageous to both. As soon as it was clear that the British fleet had departed, the commander Truxillo discovered that the Carib, either because they were still weakened by the ravages of disease and lack of food, or because they had no love lost on the British and their cause, were not in a belligerent mood. At least one faction among them, unhappy with the leaders appointed by the British, chose to join the Spanish immediately. On May 18th, they delivered up the island again to Spain. And by June, most of the Carib were resettled at Truxillo, although some remained at Rota. The record suggests that both the British and Spaniards expected to use the Caribs as soldiers in their struggle for control of Honduras and Mosquito Shore. But the Carib had a mission of their own, namely ethnic survival. And this was to guide their actions over the next 185 years, right? Okay, we go again. As has been previously suggested, Bocage, Gonzalez, and Porter, the Carib in 1797 were already partially dependent upon a cash economy, having hired out as transporters of goods while on St. Vincent, as well as having engaged in trade themselves. There were numerous necessities which they could only obtain through purchase. And although the British had given them some supplies, they were not enough to sustain them until harvest. And without canoes, they could not even fish. Although there were trees aplenty on the island from which to fashion canoes, this is a time-consuming process, and the tools they had been given may not have sufficed. Furthermore, Roatan was not extensively cleared, not having been inhabited recently, and there were too few heavy tools for this purpose. Table 2. This plus the fact that only about a month remained before the onset of the rains made it possible to do more than clear a small area. In addition, many of the seeds and cassava cuttings had been ruined by seawater and exposure on the voyage, and probably would not have germinated. Thus, it was imperative to find job opportunities, and these lay on the mainland. The news that the Carib had joined the Spaniards was both shocking and frightening to the British settlement at Belize, which was a list of provisions at Roatan. Which lived in constant fear of being attacked by His Catholic Majesty's forces. The fact that the Locutters, who with their slaves were the principal settlers, had continually violated the formal agreements between Britain and Spain as to what territories might be cut and what the nature of the British settlement should be, was provocation enough for the Spaniards, even had the countries not been formally at war. Indirect evidence makes it clear that the Belizeans had expected the Caribs to help support the occupation of the territory, right? So the Belizean, and they're calling them the Belizean, but the Belizean was not more than those who had occupied and already mixed in at that time with the people, the indigenous on Belize, the same Carib as well as along with other tribes, who, as we would show, were offshoots of the big family that they call in Carib. We know as Garifuna, that they later on called Kalinago and all those different names. Right? The British had expected the Carib to help support the occupation of the territory and were terrified by the knowledge that these famous warriors were not only lost, you hear what they call them, famous warriors, were not only lost to the British cause, but had been enlisted by the enemy. Carib, along with a number of free black French soldiers who had settled, you hear them? Free black French soldiers, black French, right? They're telling you who they were here. They were not white sailors, right? Who had settled near Truxillo only a year earlier, were using an attack on the British settlement at Black River. So all that time is, if you want to put it like that, is black on black fighting, right? as they were calling them black back then, not that we acquiesced to the name black. We were used in an attack on the British settlement at Black River, River Tinto, during the War of 1799. So are you thinking just the other day that was white people, everybody hate white people for slavery and white people do this and white people do that, when clearly they didn't. They're not around so long, nor were they producing these type of skilled craftsmanships and jobs on their own. So they could have never been doing what people blaming them for today or what they would like to take the credit for today. Right? In this, they fought against the Mosquito Indians, longtime partisans of the British. So remember when I told you some of the tribes sold out to the invaders? You're hearing it here. And they didn't sold out to people who was not looking like them. They sold out to people who was looking like them. By 1802, however, the Carib seemed to have had a change of heart, for they began to travel to Belize to cut wood, as well as to hunt and fish for the British settlers, as the Mosquito men had been doing for generations. So you see, it's a long time they had that link with them. It seems likely that the Carib were influenced to look upon the British with a less prejudiced eye by at least two circumstances. First, they had begun to make friends with the Mosquito, near whom they had settled at the Patuca River, and probably in other places, according to Bocage in 1970, but they had also begun to grow restless and resentful because of what several observers termed poor treatment given them by the Spanish at Choxillo. In 1805, the superintendent of the settlement at Belize was given secret instructions to do everything possible to further the friendship between the Carib and the Mosquito, and to assist the latter in attacking Choxillo to liberate the Caribs from their situation there. That's Burden Account 1931. Whether a Mosquito attack took place, I cannot say. But in 1807, the Caribs at Choxillo revolted and fled, seeking succor among the Mosquito. The Spanish pursued and brought them back. This suggests a slave-like position, right? So this is who they were calling slaves as again. So this suggests a slave-like position, which would have been intolerable to a people who had fought so long and so persistently against being reduced to such a status. At the same time, the settlers at Belize were trying new ploys to keep their enterprise operative. Emboldened by a decisive victory against the Spanish invading force in 1798, and driven by the exhaustion of wood in the north, illegal cutting was begun in the Stan Creek area as early as 1799 to 1800. Right? Since there were no permanent settlements there at the time, the cutters would have had to relocate their slaves or import other labor. Right? Slave ownership was already expensive in Belize because the Spanish forbade the British from growing much food, and the nature of the logging industry prevented the slaves from maintaining gardens. Thus, most food was imported. Furthermore, slaves found it an easy flight to Yucatan, the Petén, and Omoa, an important port and fortress in what is now Honduras. The more escapes, the more harshly slaves were treated. And this again, these slaves were indigenous people. And this in turn spurred more to seek freedom through purchase, military service, or flight. Two, by 1807, the slave trade was outlawed. And local, that is Caribbean supplies, were both scarce and expensive. So in 1807, they're saying, right, the slave trade was outlawed. And at the time when these beings were enslaved, they were recorded as indigenous people being enslaved. Right? Furthermore, they were likely to have been infected with revolutionary fervor. In short, the log cutters were eager to recruit good workers, and despite how it was viewed by the authorities, many of them clandestinely employed Carib men, not Africans. You understand? We can assume that undocumented or illegal immigrants would then, even as now, obtainable at a lower than ordinary range. Right? I don't want to go too much into this one because we want to just go across on the next one to give an idea of what's happening on the island around this time. So we just step across in this document for a second. Right? All this time they're talking about, you'd see here, let me just give this because they're so funny. They only put up 2 pages of this book, so we still can't get it. Right? But this is the Arena Massacre, Trinidad, that is Spanish misnomer. 1st of December 1699. Printed and published by A.L. Rhodes, MBE Government Printer, 1938. Documents relating to the massacre of the Governor Don Jose de Leon y Icales, other officials and missionaries at San Francisco de la Reina by Indians on the 1st of December 1699. 100 years before this account we're talking about on Honduras, where they were taking people from this side of the Caribbean and carrying them up to Honduras, mainly because of these wars here that was happening in the beginning of the 1700s, right? Collected and translated by Father P.J. Busink, Busink, PP, wherever that means, San Rafael, and published by the Historical Society of Trinidad and Tobago in 1938. Only 2 pages, right? If you look up here, you'd see page 1 of 2, right? Never mind, we get a book somehow. Right, so this is our other account here, right, by Erie Boomert. Erie Boomert is, forget what's the profession of this Erie Boomert, but they're connected to Leiden University in the Netherlands. Let's just check the references to get exactly where's the reference. This paper forms the outcome of research supported by the Faculty of Archaeology, Leiden University, Netherlands. They were here the other day trying to do something with the fake chief Barat, right? So yeah, they connected to these people. It received funding from the European Research Council under the European Union 7th Framework Program grant agreement, and that's the number under the direction of Professor Corinne L. Hoffman. Thanks due to Mr. Gerard A. Besson, Paria Publishing Company Limited, Port of Spain, Trinidad, for kindly allowing me to reproduce Captain Wilson's 1837 drawing of the Roman Catholic Church in Arima Mission, Figure 4, and Mr. Julian A.M. Vermeer, Faculty of Archaeology. So all these is archaeologists then. There's the Faculty of Archaeology he connected to. Right, so let's go back on our count here now. Reaching the Spanish Amerindian frontier, the Capuchin, right? That's the monks who the King of Spain sent in after they realized from the 1490s, the early 1500s to 1600s, after they realized after nearly 100 years that they can't penetrate our ancestors. Breaching the Spanish Amerindian frontier, the Capuchin missions of Trinidad and their outcome 1686 to present. When after a century of conflict, you see, 100 years of conflict, in 1592, the Spanish were finally able to get a foothold in Trinidad, right, on Carib. Due to a dire need of manpower, and yet here is not the whole island that locked down at the time. They were only in the port where it still bear its name of Spain. Due to dire need of manpower and resources, their actual political control remained limited to the northwestern portion of the island, just as I was saying, being harassed continually by the majority of Trinidad's Amerindian population. So we just scratch Trinidad and say Carib everywhere we see Trinidad, right? So being harassed continually by the majority of Carib's Amerindian population and attempts by Spain's European enemies to settle in the island in the 1680s, the local Spanish governor decided to invite Capuchin monks to establish mission village in the non-occupied parts of Carib so as to convert, discipline, Hispanicize, and exploit the local Amerindians. In the long run, this novel policy aimed at pacifying the island's indigenous population indeed turned out to be successful. So right now, in 2024, we have converted, disciplined, Hispanicized people we living amongst, because they did say it was successful, and due to all the good papers that recorded under the Corporation Trinidad and Tobago, we tend to agree with them. It's right. So, boom. In the long run, the policy aimed at pacifying, right, it was successful, although it did not take place without major setbacks. Whereas under British rule, the last surviving mission village were abandoned in 1849, right? That was 4 years after they brought in the Fatal Razak and company to do their, what they call in 1797, the Island of Experiment, right? To do the mixing. So it was abandoned in 1849. At present, small populations of pure or mixed Amerindian ancestry are still inhabiting the tongues which developed out of the mission afterwards. So all the majority of people, now this is not to burn nobody really, but the majority of people who are around these missions, like the first peoples out of the Santa Rosa teaching, all these peoples and them were evidence of tribal people who sold out, right? So those zones are full of the bloodline of people who sold out, right? Introduction. And even they're saying all of that, you'd hear what this person stated in the introduction here. Consisting predominantly of people of African, watching nonsense, East Indian, and to a lesser extent, European, Chinese, and Lebanese descent, Kairi has one of the most cosmopolitan populations in the world. The ancestors of the majority of its present inhabitants came to the West Indies as slaves or indentured laborers. You see? Nonsense, right? According to what we was reading from before, in the account before, they're saying they were settled here and then slavery ended, the Caribs and then. Now this person here is saying that the majority is Africans. Now we have no account of them coming to the island. They're just ups and say was Africans, right? Right. West Indian slaves, indentured laborers, slaves, indentured laborers during the era of colonial rule, when the island was ruled by Spain from 1797 onwards by Britain. So they're saying it was inhabited by the people of African and East Indian descent, right? Who were descendants of slaves and indentured laborers. But when Spain, as we was reading from before in the Black Carib account, when Spain was dealing with the islands, they were dealing with indigenous people, right? You'd see this writer here contradict his or herself later on. Right? Simultaneously, Kairi is one of the few West Indian islands with an established community of people regarding themselves of pure or mixed Amerindian history. I wonder why, right? We couldn't be here with Africans and the majority are we claiming an Amerindian ancestry. In all, on a multi-ethnic population of 1.5 million, there are some 1,500 people who see themselves as the descendant of original inhabitants of the land. And that is because they fell for the switch story in the 60s of African people being brought here, right? So that's why only 1,500 people see themselves as that, according to the estimate. In spite of this small number, hear this, in spite of this small number, the indigenous influence on the material, linguistic, and cultural characteristics of the complicated modern society of Kairi and Alubera remains considerable, right? So they were saying, they taught us, according to their stories, that the Africans come here and they brought the culture and this and that, but here they say now that the modern evidence suggests that the majority of cultural characteristics portray back to indigenous people. So either they're smoking cocaine or they're drinking rum or some kind of thing when they was doing this article, right? Because they clearly going back and forth with what they say. They include a wide range of ecological knowledge, subsistence practices with respect for horticulture, hunting, fishing, and food, collecting, and techniques of food preparation, material culture, traditional medicines, and religion. As Boom would account. All of this is largely due to the transmission of lifeways between the Amerindians and the African slave population of colonial times, as well as the island peasantry, which evolved out of the latter after the abolition of slavery. Rubbish again. This paper discussed the remarkable consistency of the islands in this. So apart from all of that, they're discussing the remarkable consistency of the islands' indigenous population. It's not remarkable. They just lie about who was the people. So it's not remarkable if you think about them here all the time, then it's not remarkable at all. It's just the same people, right? So they want to make it, oh, it's so remarkable that they bring Africans here and Indians here and the indigenous people still maintain so much things, and pure nonsense, right? From the contact period until present. At the time, here what they're going to contradict themselves here again. At the time of the European encounter, 1498, Kairi was a complex, multi-ethnic, and multilingual conglomerate of Amerindian tribal groups or tribal nations. They put quote unquote, they were nations, right? Caribbean speaking Karinipagoto, Yayo, Nipoyo, Arawakan or Lokono speaking Lokono, and Shibayo, and finally Warawan speaking Chaguanese. This would bring it to places like Chaguanas and Chagoramas, right? They were occupied by the Chaguanese, the Saiwani, as the next name for them, right? The Karinipagoto and the Chaguanis lived in the northwest, and the Yayo in the southwest, and the Shibayo and the Lokono on the south coast. The Nipoyo seem to have been the most numerous Amerindian tribal group, seem to have been, right? That's who they were seeing and who they could deal with or wherever they were interacting more with the Nipoyo, occupying mainly the eastern and central parts of Trinidad. But then now you have the place called Shogunas still remaining in the center of the island, right? And they hear about the Carib Pagoto and the Chaguanis living in the northwest, right? The idea is from Chaguaramas to Chaguanas, all that place, there was one tribe still, with different, and the Carib Pagoto and the Chaguanas, why they used to live together is because they were related. So it was one tribe, just different family, and the biggest out of them probably was the Carib Pagoto and the Chaguanes, right? And they said the Nipoy seem to have been the most numerous in the Amerindian tribal group, occupying mainly the eastern and central parts of Kairi, figure 1. All of these ethnic groups, so here, are the relatives lying on the mainland. They refer to the mainland on the coast of Venezuela and the Guyana, right? The Guyanas, all this you hear. Apparently, all of them manufactured or use highly distinct pottery of one particular style called the Mayoid series after the archaeological site of Mayo in the Central Range. So we have particular pottery here, hence the reason why one of the elders and them very skilled in pottery, right, and bring things from the dream realm into reality, is a Mayoid type style of pottery making. It is typified by tin-walled, largely undercoated vessels, which were tempered with caripe, the ash of quartz, rich bark of a small savanna tree species, Lycaena or Lacania or Licania or Lysania, which was formerly indigenous to the island. Where you want to bet that plant's still here. Mayoid pottery is restricted to Kairi. Only here have Mayoid pottery, right? And was made until well into the 18th century. So tell me this Mayoid pottery, right? That was only indigenous to here. And they bring so-called Africans here, and they make up the majority of the population. So who producing bomber-clad Mayoid pottery if Africans don't know how to build it, right? And the only place you're finding that is here, right? This person crazy. In colonial times, it was used as well by the Cairi Spanish for domestic purposes. According to the first documentary evidence, in contact times, Cairi was inhabited by perhaps, listen to this, some 20,000 Amerindians, suggesting that the island counted some 40 to 80 indigenous villages, each counting to 250 to 500 occupants. And of course, the number is higher. So it's more like to add an next zero, yeah, than to the 20. It's like more 200,000 of them. Occupants, right? Boom, boom, boom. South Kairi may have been the densest occupied part of the island, right? That's where they were coming into and from off the mainland. The Amerindians, and the mainland is the South American plate, which is Venezuela, Guyana, and all of them on that plate. That's the mainland, right? We only know referring to the north as the mainland because they get hip to the indigenous roots faster in terms we here have it as a secondary living, but we're not paying attention to it. In the north, it wasn't like that all the time. They're now going back to it and waking up all the information. We living like that, so we have no desire to break up the information because most of our indigenous lifestyle is still here, right? But this is why we choose to embark on a series, so we could now start to talk about it and erase the stuff that reggae music try to promote and all the other political incursions on the indigenous history, right? So 40 to 80 indigenous village, 250 to 500 per village. South Carib may have been the densest occupied. The Amerindians living there had large bell-shaped communal multi-family dwellings resembling those of the present Amerindian groups on the upper Orinoco, that's on the mainland, right? These were capable of sheltering up to 100 occupants. So then if you have bell-shaped communal living, right? And it's a whole village. So the whole village, if it could hold up to 100 occupants, right? So then what they're trying to tell us is that these villages only had 2 houses or 3 houses. Bullshit, right? Because they're saying 250 to 500. If 100 could fit in out, that is 5 houses in a village, and that not making no sense. Right? Because there was large villages, just like the one we discover recently, right? These were capable of sheltering 100 occupants. Horticulture, hunting, fishing, and collecting. 1 second. Horticulture, where I reach on horticulture, boom, boom, boom. Right, horticulture, hunting, fishing, and the collecting of invertebrates and wild vegetable foods form the mainstay of the Amerindian subsistence economy. Many food crops, notably cassava, maize, and sweet potatoes, were raised in the indigenous kitchen gardens and swidden fields, that is conucos, which gradually developed into provision grounds of colonial times. Beside fruit trees and vegetables were grown as well as non-food plants. Socio-politically, the Kairi Amerindians were organized as tribal peoples living in semi-autonomous villages. So you want to tell me these villages controlling all their affairs and they only have 2 houses or 3 houses, right? Nonsense. Leadership was fluctuating and non-hereditary. Division of labor exclusively based on sex and age. Chronic small-scale warfare characterized the intertribal relationships on the island and overseas, but it never interrupted the patterns of ceremonial exchange among mutually antagonistic tribal groups. One of the present hallmarks of the rich indigenous cultural heritage of indigenous origins in Kairi is formed by the island's many toponyms of Amerindian, either Lokono, Cariban, or Waruan derivation. They are to be found all over the island, and it can be said that Kairi most important geographical features have typically Amerindian names. Interestingly, Cariban names are most numerous in the northern part of the island, while Lokono and Waruan toponyms are to be found exclusively in the south and southwest. This conforms to the presumed distribution of the 3 major Amerindian language or linguistic families across the island in contact times. So this goes back to what I was saying. Were large families, they were called by different names, but they're speaking or they have one linguistic stock. And if you know how the easiest way to trace a people majorly is by the linguistic stock. So they would be coming from a linguistic stock, meaning that they would be cousins to where the majority of people speak that language. If they related to them, they would be speaking within that linguistic family, right? Here we go again. This confirms to presume distribution, right, throughout the island in contact times. Although quite a number of names may go back to pre-Columbian era, obviously others are of a more recent date. So they're saying quite a number of days go back before Columbus time. The Swati noble sailor. The lack of Amerindian names is on the sister isle of Alubera, called Tobago today, is noteworthy. And they only saying that because they do know that the island Alubera has a whole heap of indigenous name, right? So this person clearly, and these is the type of accounts they put out with half-truths, lies, and innuendos, so they could shape the story of what we're talking. So they're trying to squeeze in an African existence on the island when clearly it have no room for it. You follow? Unless the British were so numerous and so powerful, you understand? Like that's what they're trying to force to imagine, that they could fight a back war here, right? And back war on the African continent same way while they're kidnapping people. And they told you in the other account that they occupied the British forces here in the West Indies and the British forces in Europe. So it had no more British forces, right? So we go in again. Where was I? Right. The multitude of present toponyms of indigenous derivation illustrates the continuous Amerindian presence on the island throughout its history, right? They never kill us out. We never die out or nothing like that. We were always here and we're still here. They just change the name and some of you accept the name. Black, Afro-Trinidadian, Trinidadian, Trinbagonian, Trini, and all that type of nonsense. And indeed, as late as the second half of the 18th century, prior to the development of the island as a major plantation colony in the 1780s, right? Amerindians still formed, you see, this person just biting up the tongue. They're saying the development of the island as a major plantation colony in the 1780s. Amerindians still form the majority of the inhabitants of Carib. I didn't write this, right? This Erie Boom, wherever his name is, or her name, right? Spanish settlement, we are half an hour again. Spanish settlement and Amerindian resistance. From the first years of the European Amerindian encounter on Kairi was repeatedly raided for indigenous, hear how this person biting up the tongue, indigenous slaves. Right? It had no such thing as an indigenous slave. The only people could be slaves is the Slavics and them from Europe. Right? But after that pattern, they started to call everybody, this is a modern writing, so they use in modern terms. Right? But they still have the references at the bottom, and they're telling you what they want to depict about what happened here on the island, while using some facts and squeezing in some bullshit about African slavery, right? When nothing of the sort existed. They tell you here, from the first years of European Amerindian encounter, Kairi was repeatedly raided for indigenous slaves. So they was taking multiple people from the island, because as we read high up, it had so much, here was like a hub, much more today just now. Just take a whole heap up in as we just make this point. Right now, the island is still a hub for all kind of nefarious activities, right? It's ironic that that was the same position it had back in the latter times. It was a hub for tribes used to come and congregate here. They used to do the trading because we had a whole empire in the Southgate. Kairi is literally the beginning of the Southgate, or the opening of the Southgate, right? Because all the Amazonians and all of those brothers and sisters who were on the South American plate, they used to come up through here, or use the connection, if you just draw a map. Use the connection through up by the Bering, well, we ain't talking about the Bering Strait yet, up through by the Yucatan Peninsula, right? They would use those routes to be going back and forth between the north and the south, right? And here would be one of the places they would connect with to go to the north. And this was its position since time immemorial. Hence the reason why they could do it so skillfully here now. And some of the people in them, some of the non-documented travelers carry their business from here straight up the road and sailing within between islands, and still they can't stop them. Right? So it's ironic that the same thing happening right now happened back then, and that's what it was using it for. Right? Meanwhile, we had those, most of them who were settled here as well. Right? So we're going again. So here was repeatedly raided for indigenous slaves to be employed, we're continuing, as gold miners and sugar estate workers in the young colony of Hispaniola. Right? Again, this corresponding with what Ms. Gonzalez was saying in the last talk account, that they were taking people from the lesser Antilles and bringing them to the greater Antilles, right? Hispaniola will fit into the greater Antilles. And from here, they took people to Haiti. Hispaniola, for those of you who don't understand the Spanish name, Hispaniola is Haiti, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, right? So the majority of them on the island related to us here. Imagine that. Following the first Spanish settlement in the region on Cubagua and Margarita, in order to exploit the rich pearling grounds of these islands, they used to get pearls here, just like Pirates of the Caribbean, the Black Pearl, right? The demand for slave labor increased strongly due to the drastic demographic decline of the local Amerindians in the Greater Antilles as the result of imported European disease, just like I was saying before, against which the indigenous population had no natural resistance, including smallpox. This is how they was dying out. Measles and influenza, and the harsh forced labor conditions. In addition to slaving expeditions, peaceful battle also took place between the Spanish and Carib's Amerindians, the latter exchanging foodstuff, pearls, guanine, which is gold or copper. That's what they used to call it, guanine. Guanine objects, salt, exotic woods, pigments, etc. for European metal tools and other manufacturers, right? Which I'm sure we would come upon evidence that they were also mining metals here before contact with the Swati Europeans. In these years, the Locono of South Caire and the mainland coast even established a long-lasting trade relationship with the Spanish of the Pearl Islands, delivering foodstuffs and slaves to the latter, right? So the Arawak used to deliver orders. So they used to make, when we were smaller, they used to make you think the Arawak was the peaceful one, and the Arawak is seen here or recorded here as delivering slaves to this to the Spanish, right? Throughout most of the 16th century, Spanish, so this throughout most of the 16th century, when they say slavery from the African continent was supposed to be have existed, Spanish attempts to settle on Caire remain unsuccessful, largely due to the fierce resistance shown by the local Amerindians, right? They say non-Arawak. So the most of the Locono one them used to link with the French then. In the 1530s, for instance, a Carinipagoto chieftain and great man, Bokunar, was able to unite a large number of Amerindian tribal groupings of Caire and the Paria Peninsula in his struggle to keep the Spanish from the island. The account is Morales Pardron, and Wise 1934, 2012, and this Wise is 1934. right? All these is accounts that you could go look up. When the latter were finally able to get a foothold on Cairi in 1592, their area of political control remained limited to the northwestern portion. From the onset of their occupation of northwest Cairi, the Spanish attempted to establish an encomienda system among the Amerindian peoples on the island. Only, listen to this, only a small fraction of the indigenous population was involved in this system of Amerindian control and exploitation, as merely 4 encomienda villages, as known as commands, could be founded. Situated close to the main Spanish settlement, San Jose de Oruna, what they call St. Joseph, right? And its harbor, Puerto de España, right? Port of Spain. So the furthest they could have reached was St. Joseph from Port of Spain. At present, 3 of these villages are still centers of population. They were connected with the Spanish town by the present Eastern Main Road, then a bridle path, which is a royal road, was kept open by the Amerindians of the encomiendas, most likely Nipoyo and Locono, right? As we were saying before, sellout tribes. Plenty of the people who sold out was from these tribes. Lacking capital and human resources, the Spanish community remained weak, and throughout the 17th and most of the 18th centuries, San Jose de Orunia was not more than a poor town consisting of wattle and daub huts with thatched roofs and similarly constructed public buildings. Its poverty is archaeologically shown by recovery of only small amounts of Spanish majolica and that of predominantly local Mayoid pottery during excavations in the center of the town. In all of Cairi's Spanish community and its allies did not count more than a few hundred people, right? So even though they had sellouts from the tribe and they come in with the invaders, it was only just about a few hundred people. A frontier now developed between the Spanish and the Cairi Amerindians, who kept resisting and retreated as, and they're talking about in late, what are we talking about here? What was the time frame to give here? Hold 1 second. All right. Okay, they're giving it the time here. Right, so boom, boom, boom. It's poverty, all right. Cairi Spanish community and its allies did not count more than right. A frontier now developed between the Spanish and the Cairi Amerindians, who kept resisting and retreated as far as possible into the interior of the island. Many of the latter, including the Ayo, Shibayo, Karenipagoto, and even the Locono, now left Cairi, flying especially to Alubera and to Guyana coastline. And everybody, at one point in time, it had one set of Guyanese coming across here. And it's like there some magnet was drawing them to here. Well, the magnet is the genetic link. As a result, by the 1650s, only some 4,000 Amerindians were left on the island. That is according to their counting, because it wasn't throughout all the island. One of the bones of contention with the Spanish attempts to prevent the Cairi Amerindians from trading with the French, English, and Dutch merchant vessels, which were increasingly visiting the island, especially bartering foodstuffs and tobacco for European iron tools and other manufacturers. This was a long-established tradition going back to the mid-16th century and involved especially the Amerindians on the island's south and west coast. However, he or the Spanish considered the presence of the other European nations in the Caribbean as illegal and rightly feared that trade as well as plunder formed the aims of the contraband traders. In 1595, one of these privateers, Sir Walter Raleigh, even invaded Cairi and together with the Carini Pagato or Pagoto destroyed St. Joseph, but except for freeing a number of local chiefs who had been chained and tortured by the Spanish, his short sojourn on the island did not have any lasting repercussions. Right? They say he discovered the Pitch Lake. Right? While other people been using from it hundreds of years before his grandparents was in a nut spot. It is ironical that in the first decades of the 17th century, the Spanish, left alone by the empire in their poverty, started to promote the cultivation of tobacco among its settlers and in the encomiendas in order to trade it illicitly with the French, English, and Dutch vessels which called at the island. The whole region, including the Venezuelan coastline and the lower Orinoco Valley, now came to depend on this trade. And they make you feel that it was African slaves dealing with tobacco as well. Right? Nonsense. Which the Spanish crown could only discourage by forbidding to cultivate tobacco at all. They make it illegal. Thereby plunging the Spanish community after a decade of boom years, 1604 to 1612, into poverty again, according to Lorimer, 1978. A major challenge to the Spanish control of Cairi was presented in the 1630s by an alliance here again between the Nipoyo of North Central Cairi and the Dutch, who at the time was settled at Great Courland Bay on the leeward coast of Alubera, and they have a flag for the Great Courlands on them, right? And they're telling you it's in the 1800s. I see this recorded as, right? Here they're saying in the 1630s, right? And then we know about the 1,000 years, the 700 to 1,000 years they add on to current history to distort and what they do by the clone characters and plan them later on in the timeline when they never even existed, or only one of them existed in certain cases, right? So which time frame was this, the 1600s or the 1800s? Here they constructed two fortifications. The major one was situated on the top of a cliff above the mouth of the Courland River, in which the two strongholds of settlement had developed. The indigenous insurgents of Cairi were led by a major chieftain and great man called Hairima, who we know as Caira, whose name is sufficiently alike that of the present tongue of Arima to suggest a connection. Hairima would turn out to be the most formidable opponent of the Spanish in the 17th century. So again, when were they bringing slaves here? From the African continent. He visited the Dutch in Tobago, offering to raise tobacco for them in exchange of Dutch support in dislodging the Spanish from the island, as he had killed 2 Spaniards in some encounter. Hairima, who had been a slave on an encomienda, he was indigenous and they call him a slave, on an encomienda 11 years previously, was called the most famous and powerful amongst the Nipoyo, and according to the Spanish, considered the chief by others. The Dutch now founded 2 small fortifications in East Cairi, and in order to facilitate the transshipment to Europe of the expected tobacco harvest. Actually, it did not come of an anticipated attack on the Spanish in St. Joseph, as the latter struck first. After having conquered the Dutch establishment in Caire, they made the passage to Alubera and destroyed the Dutch fortifications and settlement on the smaller island. Right? And we would finish at the bottom of this. Right. Subsequently, Hairima settlements and provision grounds were devastated. He took revenge the following year when he joined the Dutch expedition force from Essequibo, present Guyana. So he was linking. So as much as they want to isolate him to here alone, you had to understand that the families on Caire were also related to the families on the mainland, right? So hence the reason why they could pick him up all in Guyana, right? In the Essequibo region, consisting primarily of local Amerindians, and sacked to St. Joseph 1637. The events had a sequel when a Spanish relief expedition was sent to Caire and the following year, and the town could be rebuilt. The Nipoyo were punished, and 30 of them sold as slaves to Margarita and Cumana. Hairima's fate is unknown. Following this disaster, the Spanish carefully refrained from attacking the small English colonies that were founded on Caire's south and northeast coast in the 1640s. They were short-lived, however. So we've seen here, even though some of the accounts are accurate, some parts it accurate, other parts, the writer themselves falling on their own words, right? But needless to say, well, let me check where we go back out. We hopefully I get the next document by next Wednesday, because Saturday class we're doing something different. But this is the beginning of the series where we go into the actual meat of the matter as to what was happening into the Caribbean, because it's not covered as much as it should be when it played a key important role in world history, and the records here would even debunk their slavery story, as we prove time and time again. The slavery story, for most of you who are around my age would know that they used to call it the Middle Passage, right? Before it turned into the transatlantic slave trade, page 154 we are here, right? So we continue part 2 on the history of the Caribbeans as it pertains to Caire and Alubera and environs, because we all linked, we all one family connected to the mainland, the South American plate, that had a vast, booming empire even before North America, right? That's the claim. Because South American plate consists of places like Chile, Argentina, where the oldest pyramid was found, and all these places. And right now, hence the reason why these Operation Paperclip guys from Germany after World War II went into Argentina. They're still operating out of certain places there. And right now, the globalists them clear out at least a size 2 times bigger than Caire in the Amazon to play. They want to put down solar panels, right? Pure rubbish. So they said they're destroying the trees to save the climate because they're letting off carbon dioxide. But these Muzungu on them at the end, and their cells can't take this heat and the sun cycle, so you'd hear them malfunctioning and speaking whole heap of nonsense as their establishments for crumble, right? But nevertheless, this we come to another end of this shadows class. All right, so any questions while we at it for a while before we go? Questions, additions, comments. I know a lot of people read and research a couple of things that they could relate this information to, as well as our oral traditions by our elders in our family, like mine, who told me they know nothing about slavery. They never hear about slavery only until around the 60s. Right? So, okay. So I guess we have second.